Hello, my name is Dr. Joseph Crumbley. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I'll be your narrator through this module on loyalty issues. This module is one of 5 modules that have been developed for a course entitled Engaging Relative Caregivers, Managing Risk Factors in Kinship Care. You're now about to watch a video clip of me doing training with professionals on kinship care, and I'll be addressing several questions during this presentation. The first question is, what are the cues and sources of loyalty issues experienced by relative caregivers? The second question is, what are the goals, approaches, and scripts you can use with relative caregivers to help them manage their loyalties? And the third question is, how are loyalty issues different for relative caregivers from non-relative foster parent and adoptive parents? I have 2 questions for the listening audience as well. And that question is, how do loyalty issues impact a relative caregiver's ability to provide safety, well-being, and permanency for the children in their care? And the second question is, what goals, approaches, and scripts would be useful in your practice with relative caregivers? So please sit back, relax, and I'll rejoin you after the conclusion of this clip to summarize the training. Thank you. Okay. Loyalty. One of the questions we all have to ask that makes us apprehensive and sometimes afraid to place children in kinship care is the relative caregiver able to place their loyalty for the child before that of who? The birth parent. Okay? And I'll repeat that again. Loyalty becomes a risk factor when a relative caregiver is not able to place the needs of the child over that of the birth parent. Why? All right, go back to your courses on bonding and attachment. Go back to your courses on object identification, all those courses. Put it together, and here's my question to you. A relative caregiver's initial experiences of loyalty are with whom first? The child in their care or the child's birth parent? The birth parent. Foster parent, initial experiences of loyalty are with whom first? The child. Even for the relative caregiver, even if it's dysfunctional, even if it's hostile, whatever the quality is, that initial experience is with the birth parent. So relative caregivers, because of that initial experience, are vulnerable to these kinds of questions and comments from birth parents. You said you're putting the child before me? The child comes first? You always put everything before me. You put your friends before me. You put your drugs and alcohol before me. How many times did you leave me alone to babysit because you were out with your friends? You even put your girlfriends before me. You even put your girlfriend's children before me. You had me babysitting them. And now you want to put my child before me. When are you going to finally put me first? Here's a second comment. You say I can't come in because of a restraining order. Wait a minute. I let you come in no matter what. Even when there was a bench warrant on you, I still let you in. Even when you were stealing from me for your drugs and alcohol, I let you in. And now you say I can't come in because of a restraining order? Or how about this one? You can't bend the rules. Wait a minute. You bent the rules when it was convenient for you. You didn't mind bending the rules telling me to stay home from school and babysit. You didn't mind bending the rules telling me to lie to the bill collector when they called. You didn't mind telling me to lie and even say I was you and pretend I was you when the bill collector called. And now you say you can't bend the rules? Well, how about this one? You say, you're telling me that you're going to put a restraining order on me. You're telling me you're going to turn me in. You're telling me I can't stay. But then you still expect me to pick up your medication. You still expect me to be your ride. You still expect me to be there for you when you need me. You still expect me to pay your bills and go to the post office. But you can't be there for me. You see the vulnerability? And now can you hear all that coming out? And next thing you know, the caregiver is saying, okay, come on in. Okay, all right, you can stay. Yeah, I owe you. Yeah, I need you to pick up my medication, so please come on in. Sweetheart, go let your mom in through the front door. It's okay. You even got the child colluding with you now. Okay? Violating the orders. But can you see why? That's the vulnerability relative caregivers are susceptible to because of loyalty issues. And the loyalty issues are on a longer continuum for relative caregivers. It goes from feelings of disloyalty, split loyalties, dual loyalties, and betrayal. Relative caregivers can experience that whole continuum. So what are the other sources for the feelings of disloyalty? Replacing the birth parents in terms of authority and taking their position. That can make you feel like you're being disloyal. Split loyalties. Who should you love first? Who should you care for first? Placing the child's needs over that of the birth parent. Another source of disloyalty or feelings of disloyalty is when you're disclosing information about the birth parent. You're going to have to tell the agency about when they were late, how often they showed up. You've got to supervise the visit. You got to let agencies know if they're using drugs. And you know it's information that you're sharing that's going to be used against the birth parent. That can make you feel like you're being disloyal. In fact, that can even make you feel like you're betraying. Pursuing permanent relationship. To pursue a relationship is to compete with the birth parent. To pursue a formal relationship as a foster parent or adoptive parent can mean like you're being disloyal. Allowing the child to attach to you and call you mom. Allowing the child to attach to you and call you dad. That can make you feel disloyal. And guess who reminds you of you being disloyal? The birth parent. You letting my child call you mom? You know, I'm her mom. You're letting her do that. Child says that she doesn't want to go home. Child says that she wants to stay with mom. You know, child says that she doesn't want to be with the mom anymore. You put that in her head. Look what you're vulnerable to. And then interactions around the child supersede the needs of the family. For us, it's just a policy issue. Get your clearance, get your fingerprints, get your background checks. That's a policy issue for us because we ask them to do that. For relative caregiver, that becomes a loyalty issue. Because when that family member can't stay because they have a background check that was criminal, or if that family member has to be asked to leave because they didn't get the proper clearance, or when family members can't come over unless you were there to supervise, because of criminal background checks. You're now placing the needs of the children over who? The family. And that can be looked at as disloyalty. So the disloyalty is not only with the birth parent, but the extended family can be affected by that as well. Your cues that let you know that relative caregivers are experiencing either loyalty, split loyalties, dual loyalties, or betrayal, or cues like this. I can't see my child on the street. She's always been there when I needed her. I can't put my brother out because of some criminal check. This is his house as well as mine. I can't choose between my son and grandchild when it comes to who lives in this house. That birth parent has a right to be here just like my grandchild. The birth parent has more of a right here because this is where they grew up as my brother or as my sister or as my son or as the daughter. I can't ask my relatives to have background checks in their home because this is their home. I just live here and I'm going to tell them to leave. My sister or family would never forgive me if I adopted the child. I'll keep the child, but I won't adopt. You have to ask my brother for that information if you want to know. I'm not going to share that with you. I'm not going to turn them in. I'm not going to get that information knowing that you're going to use it against them. So what do you do? What are your goals? Your first goal is to get relative caregivers to prioritize the child's safety and well-being and permanency over that of the birth parent. And you can see the issue here because the attachment and the bonding is with the birth parent first, and now you're saying I'm going to place the needs of the child over that of the birth parent, triggers disloyalty. Redefining pre-existing relationships and roles with the birth parent and with the extended family. One of the things in kinship care is that before the child, there are roles and responsibilities and loyalties that existed before the child was placed. Family members tend to think that even if the child is moved in, and even if the child is living with them, they still expect you to have the same loyalties that you did before the child was placed. they expect you to have. They expect the same entitlements, the same loyalties, the same commitments. That's not supposed to change. And in reverse, too, the relative caregiver feels as though they should have the same commitment and loyalty to you before the child moved in, and they're expecting the same loyalty back from the birth parents. So those pre-existing relationships become a problem in terms of changing roles. And then the triggers. You've got to help relative caregivers identify what the triggers are, because the trigger for the relative caregiver that make them feel as though they're betraying might be, you weren't there for me, you were in prison, you were doing drugs and alcohol, you got pregnant too early. What are the triggers? What's going to push their buttons to make them bend the rules? And then the relative caregiver has to have that repertoire of responses that they can have with themselves. Your dialogue becomes their monologue with themselves to protect themselves from being manipulated and victimized. And they've got to have that repertoire so that they can prevent that. And finally, getting relative caregivers to stop seeing the birth parent as a child, as their little brother or little sister or big brother, big sister, or son or daughter. So how do we do that? First is prioritizing the child. When your cue for when you know that you need to do that is when you hear relative care saying things like, I need to help him. I need to help her. I was always there for her. She's dependent on me. Your response is going to be, need to be, and who needs you the most? Your cue, when you hear things like, I can't turn my back on him. That's my son. That's my daughter. They need my help. Response, who's less able to help themselves? I've always been there for them. They can't make it without me. We're a family. Your response may need to be, well, whose turn is it now? Redefining roles and relationships. When you start hearing things like, well, they don't have a place to stay. I've got to let them in. They can't be on the street. Your response may need to be, you can't be a parent to both your son and your grandson. You're only one person. You got an IEP meeting tomorrow morning. Either you're going to go to the IEP meeting or you're going to the arraignment. Which one are you going to go to? You're only one person. You may lose your grandson if you try to be a parent to both. You've got to make that team meeting. You've got to show up for those appointments. You've got to get them to therapy. If you don't get that child to therapy, the child might end up being removed. The child, I can't let them stay on the street. Another cue. I've got to let them in. They were always there for me. So how can I not be there for them? Who needs your home the most? Who else can help them now? Because now you're redefining roles. The way you can help them is by caring for their son, not for caring for them. You see how the role reversed? You're caring for the child, not for them. So it's a change. Identifying the triggers. 3 things need to happen with the trigger. The first is you have to help that relative caregiver identify the pattern in terms of how they were involved in helping that relative caregiver. So this is an example of identifying the pattern. When your sister calls afraid that she has overdosed, you've always picked her up and brought her to the home. That's the pattern. The second thing that you're going to need to do is to talk to them about why the pattern has to change. So here's the script. What are you going to do different now that your nephew is under a protection order from their mother? That's the why the pattern has to change. And then the third thing is to talk to them about how things are going to be different, how the pattern's going to be different, and what you're going to do different. So here's the conversation. Who else can call her since you can't take care of both of them? You already are helping her by caring for her child. That's what the triggers. Not infantilizing the birth parent. I know your son will always feel like your child, and that's normal, but who will the courts and agencies expect you to take care of first? So we're not telling you to stop looking at him as your child. In fact, that's not pathology. You will always, relative caregivers will always look at that. I'm even making it more personal. Your parents will always look at you as what? Thank you. That's not pathology. They're going to always look at you that way. So for the relative caregiver, you normalize it, but they need to know that the courts are going to be looking at your son, your daughter, or your sister, brother as what? adults, and they're going to expect you to place the needs of the children over that of adults. When we start looking at what's the differences for relative caregivers, those issues of attachment and bonding, pre-existing relationships, are always going to make them feel as though the birth parent should come first. It's going to make them feel as though that's where their loyalty should be, and when they aren't, they're going to feel as though they're being disloyal. For foster parents, there's no pre-existing relationship. They don't know that birth parent. That initial relationship was with the child. So it's going to be important for the relative caregiver to look at what are those triggers. Here's the implications for your practice. Number one, we must do assessments. You have to identify what those triggers are for the relative caregivers and why they're being triggered. Number two, preparation and training looks different with relative caregivers as it does from non-relative foster parents and adoptive parents. They have to understand how their loyalty can impact their ability to protect, how their loyalty can impact their ability to provide safety planning. And then your work's going to have to be the individual work with the families, get into to look at what are your individual triggers. Is it going to be incarceration? Is it going to be that birth parent throwing up in your face that you were on drugs? Is the button going to be that you partied too much? You know, is the button going to be that you were incarcerated and therefore didn't have time for me? What's the button that can get pushed? And then what's the repertoire that you're going to use to help protect yourself from being manipulated? It's important to understand that for relative caregivers, in order for them to protect the children, they have to first protect who? Themselves. And that's protecting themselves from being manipulated and victimized so that they can protect the child from being manipulated and victimized. Safety planning starts with relative caregivers first before you can protect the child. Okay, well, thank you so much. I'd like to thank Annie E. Casey for allowing me to do this training. And I'd like to thank you for taking time to come and be a part of this training. I hope this training is useful. Take care. Hello, welcome back. What I would like to do now is summarize the training in the videotape by starting with what are the cues and sources of loyalty issues for relative caregivers. I think it's important to understand that loyalty issues can go along a continuum for relative caregivers. They can experience dual loyalties, split loyalties, and betrayal. So they can experience that continuum at any time. I think it's important to understand that loyalties become an issue when that relative caregiver isn't able to protect. So loyalty is not pathology. It's normal for relative caregivers to want to place the needs of the birth parent before that of the children. It's just that when they can't protect and implement those plans, that's the red flag. The sources of loyalties, the sources of loyalty issues for relative caregivers can come from having to replace the relative caregiver's authority, the children becoming more attached to the relative caregiver than to the birth parent, having to develop a formal relationship, become a foster parent or an adoptive parent. That could be another source. Having to share information with you, the agency, that's going to be used against the birth parent. That can become another source of feeling as though you're betraying and being disloyal. So we've got a variety of issues, and the ultimate one, to me, if I had to look at what was paramount in terms of what's the biggest trigger for disloyalty, is when they have to place the needs of the children over that of who? The birth parents. That's the ultimate one, because their initial attachment has been with the birth parent, not with the child. And now when they have to reverse it, they're vulnerable to feeling disloyal. The cues you need to look for are things like, how can you put that child before me? You knew me first. Another cue might be, I was always there for you, through your incarceration, through your substance abuse, through your fights. I even threw myself between you and that man that was beating you up. Those are the things that relative caregivers are vulnerable to in terms of what pushes the buttons. When we start looking at scripts, they're going to need to hear you say things like, if not you, then who? Whose turn is it now? Who needs to be the one cared for first? What's going to happen if the child gets removed? Those are the scripts that are very important for them to hear. If you're not there, then where is the child going to live? So they need to hear those scripts that are going to be able to get them to realize that the needs of the children, because they have to live with the feelings of disloyalty. They don't go away. So how do they live with it? And that's why those scripts are so important. And you're giving them those scripts so that they could use those scripts with themselves. Those dialogues that you're having becomes monologues for relative caregivers to use with themselves. And they need those monologues so that they'll be able to protect themselves from being manipulated and from being victimized. Because in kinship care, relative caregivers have to first protect themselves from being manipulated and victimized in order to protect the child. Okay, well, thank you very much. Annie Casey, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to present, and I hope you find this information useful in your practice. Thank you.